a whisper in the attic, or something darker? Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Revela. Tell me where you're listening from. It connects us all. Your comments make this journey special. Now, let's uncover the shadows. It was on a crisp June afternoon in the quiet village of St. Aldhelms, when the annual garden fete at the vicarage commenced. The lawns stretched wide with their neat rows of trestle tables, laden with Victoria sponge, seed cake, and homemade lemonade. Children darted about with sticky fingers. Women compared their rose cuttings with genteel pride, and the men gathered near the church hall argued about cricket fixtures. Miss Marple, in her delicate lace gloves and with her customary gentle smile, sat comfortably in a wicker chair near the shade of the great oak. She did not care much for fetes, though she was fond of people-watching, and the vicar's wife had pressed her to attend. It was precisely this setting, the innocent gaiety of bunting and brass band, that made the sudden interruption all the more dreadful. At 4:30, just as the raffle was being announced, a piercing cry split the air. The sound came from the upper floor of the vicarage, a place ordinarily off-limits during the fete. Silence fell across the green. Then a flurry of anxious voices. The vicar rushed forward, his face ashen, calling for someone to fetch the constable. Moments later, young Lucy Armitage, the maid of all work at the vicarage, appeared at the doorway, pale as death. Her hands trembled as she tried to speak. "In the attic! Oh, sir, there's someone!" The crowd surged, curiosity battling with propriety. Miss Marple, who had not stirred from her chair, merely tilted her head ever so slightly, her blue eyes sharp and calculating beneath her straw hat. Soon after, the constable emerged, puffing heavily from the stairs, his expression grave. "It's Miss Harriet Blunt," he said, naming the vicar's widowed cousin, who had only arrived in the village a fortnight ago. "She's dead, stone dead, in the attic." A collective gasp rippled across the villagers. Someone whispered, "An accident." Another, more daring, murmured, "Murder!" Miss Marple quietly folded her gloved hands in her lap. Her gaze drifted toward the attic window, where the lace curtain stirred faintly, though no breeze blew. She alone noticed the peculiar thing, that Harriet Blunt had no reason whatsoever to be in that attic, and it was never a trivial matter when people were found in places they had no earthly business being. The fete, so carefully arranged, dissolved into chaos. Gossip took root before the constable could order the house cleared. Miss Marple, as serene as ever, watched and listened, as though noting the shifting patterns of a tapestry only she understood. Something had cast a shadow over St. Aldhelms, and in her quiet way she already suspected that human nature, eternally predictable in its frailties, would soon reveal the truth. Would you like me to continue with part 2? The village reacts, where the gossip spreads, and each villager's suspicions begin to take shape. The shock of the discovery lingered in the air long after the constable's heavy words had fallen. The summer afternoon, once filled with the scent of roses and the cheerful drone of bees, seemed suddenly oppressive, as though the very village held its breath. At first there was silence, stunned, incredulous silence. Then, as though someone had tugged at a hidden thread, a wave of whispers began to ripple through the gathered crowd. They tried, at first, to temper their curiosity with propriety, speaking in hushed tones and lowered voices. Yet the sharp edge of gossip, once released, is not easily contained. Miss Harriet Blunt had been a figure of interest from the moment she arrived in St. Aldhelms, and now her sudden death, strange, unaccountable, in the dim confines of the vicarage attic, made her an irresistible subject. Mrs. Banbury, the baker's wife, was among the first to voice her thoughts aloud. With her plump face flushed from both heat and scandal, she leaned toward Mrs. Linton, the postmistress, her voice pitched just high enough for half the village to hear. I knew from the moment she came here, never did like the way she carried herself, always peering about, as though she were above us all, and her questions, heavens, always prying into this person and that. Mark my words, she was meddling in something she ought not to. Mrs. Linton pursed her lips. She was a careful woman, not one to speak rashly, yet even she could not resist a comment. Well, she must have had a reason for being up there. What business would a lady like her have in a dusty attic, unless she was looking for something? A murmur of assent ran through the group. Already the idea of Harriet Blunt as a woman caught in some secretive errand took hold. Suspicion, in the minds of villagers, rarely required evidence. It merely needed a plausible tale. Nearer the house, young Lucy Armitage still clutched her apron, her wide eyes darting nervously from one villager to another. The girl's lips trembled as she tried to explain, yet her words came out in a jumbled rush. I heard a creak overhead, sir, while I was fetching the teacups. Thought it was a bird, maybe, or the wind, but then I went up and she was just lying there, so still with her eyes. Oh, it was dreadful. She broke off into sobs, comforted by Mrs. Price, the kindly wife of the greengrocer. The constable, a stocky fellow named Sergeant Weatherby, cleared his throat in a manner that suggested authority rather than confidence. "That'll do, Miss Armitage. You've told us enough for now. No more chattering." He wiped his brow, clearly uneasy with the magnitude of his task. A sudden death was one thing, a possible murder quite another. He glanced about at the assembled villagers as though seeking assistance, or at least silence. It was then that Mr. Clement, the vicar, stepped forward. His voice, though trembling, held the tone of clerical authority that had soothed his parishioners through funerals, floods, and the occasional scandal. "My dear friends, I must beg you all to return to your homes. This is a matter for the police. There will be time enough for questions and explanations, but for now, I urge you all to allow Sergeant Weatherby to do his duty." The crowd obeyed, reluctantly, haltingly, and with many a backward glance toward the vicarage. In twos and threes they drifted away, their heads bent together, voices carrying half-formed theories and whispered speculations down the village lanes. A death in St. Aldhelm's was no small matter, and a suspicious one even less so. Miss Marple remained seated beneath the oak, her expression as mild as ever. One might have thought she had not heard a word of the tumult, so placidly did she smooth the lace at her cuff. Yet her eyes, clear and watchful, had taken in every flicker of reaction. The blanching of Mrs. Banbury's cheeks, the nervous haste with which Mr. Pritchard, the chemist, had slipped away, the curious way in which Lucy Armitage had avoided the gaze of her mistress. When at last the grounds were nearly empty, Miss Marple rose and made her way to the vicar's side. "Dear Mr. Clement," she said in her soft, tremulous voice, "what a dreadful business this must be for you. To have your fate of all occasions marred in such a way, it hardly seems fair." The vicar sighed heavily, running a weary hand over his thinning hair. "It is most unfortunate, Miss Marple. Poor Harriet. She was not well liked, I fear, though she was family. Still, one hardly expects—" He faltered, his face clouding. "No, indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "One never does expect such things, though they do happen more often than people suppose. Of course, one can hardly wonder that tongues are already wagging. Villages are such curious places for keeping secrets. Have you noticed how very quickly gossip travels?" The vicar looked at her with a faint frown, uncertain whether she meant comfort or rebuke. Miss Marple smiled serenely, and with a gentle pat of his sleeve she drifted away, leaving him to his duties. She walked slowly down the lane toward her cottage, her step unhurried, her manner outwardly untroubled. Yet within her mind the patterns were already forming. Harriet Blunt had been a stranger, yet not wholly unknown. Miss Marple had observed her in church, at the shops, and on the vicarage lawn. She had seen the sharpness of her gaze, the faint hauteur in her manner, and the eagerness with which she pressed questions that seemed, on the surface, innocent enough. Harriet had been a woman seeking something, and now she was dead in an attic where she had no business. That, to Miss Marple, was not coincidence but design. That evening the village was alive with speculation. At the Rose and Crown, the local inn, Mr. Peters the landlord listened with relish as his patrons aired their theories. Some declared it a case of weak heart. After all, Harriet had been pale and nervous of late. Others whispered of poison, remembering too well that her cousin, the late Colonel Blunt, had died under curious circumstances years before. The older villagers, more inclined toward drama, spoke of family curses and whispered grudges. But beneath the chatter, unease lingered, for each knew in their own private heart that murder was not an impossible thing. People killed for money, for jealousy, for spite, and Harriet Blunt, with her prying ways, might easily have stirred some long-buried resentment. Miss Marple, sipping her evening tea by the window of her neat little parlour, heard the faint hum of voices drifting up from the lane. She sat quite still, the lamplight catching the silver of her hair. Her knitting lay idle in her lap. She was thinking of Lucy Armitage's trembling hands, of Mrs. Banbury's sudden eagerness to speak ill of the dead, of the chemist's furtive departure. Patterns. People always revealed themselves, if one only knew where to look. The following morning, Sergeant Weatherby arrived at the vicarage with Inspector Graves from the county police. The inspector, a thin, brisk man with a clipped moustache, was not one to linger over pleasantries. By 10:30, he had ordered the attic examined and the body removed. He spoke briefly with the vicar and his wife, then summoned Lucy Armitage for questioning. The villagers, of course, found reason to linger nearby. They loitered at shop doors, strolled along the lane, and peered from garden gates, each hoping for a tidbit of news. Rumour spread with the speed of wildfire. Harriet had been strangled, someone said. No, it was poison, insisted another. She had been clutching a scrap of paper, someone else swore. The truth, concealed by police discretion, became embroidered with each retelling. Miss Marple, walking sedately towards the post office, paused now and then to exchange a word with her neighbours. She never asked direct questions, only listened, her eyes mild, her manner gentle. People spoke freely to her, for who could suspect that such an elderly spinster, with her soft voice and gentle smile, could be anything other than a repository for idle chatter? By noon, she had gathered more than Sergeant Weatherby might learn in a week. She knew that Harriet Blunt had been seen quarrelling with Mrs. Linton over a misdelivered letter. She knew that the widow had asked the chemist peculiar questions about sleeping draughts. She knew, too, that Harriet had taken tea only last week with young Arthur Price, the greengrocer's son, and that the meeting had caused a stir, for Arthur was betrothed to sweet Mary Hill, and his attentions to another woman were most unwelcome. All these small threads wove themselves together in Miss Marple's mind, though she made no sign of it. She simply collected her stamps, exchanged a remark about the weather, and walked home. Yet her step was thoughtful, and her eyes, for all their mildness, were bright with quiet purpose. The village, unsettled and restless, continued to buzz with conjecture. But Miss Marple knew that truth was not found in gossip. It was found in the small, overlooked details, the curious silences, the unguarded remarks. the tiny actions that revealed more than any grand confession. And in St. Aldhelm's, she was certain. Those details were waiting to be discovered. She only had to listen. And so the shadow deepened over the village, though the sun still shone. Behind lace curtains and closed doors, secrets stirred, waiting for the gentle hand of an old lady to draw them into the light. For Miss Marple knew what the others did not, that death, in a place as small and tightly bound as St. Aldhelm's, never came without reason, and human nature, timeless and unfailing, would soon betray the guilty hand that had set these events in motion. The inspector's arrival lent the vicarage a new air of severity. The villagers, who had begun to treat the affair as half scandal and half entertainment, now realized that the matter was being taken very seriously indeed. Inspector Graves was a man of brisk efficiency, accustomed to cutting through obfuscation with a sharp question and a sharper look. His presence, however, did little to quell the undercurrent of speculation. If anything, it deepened it. People believed that the sterner the policeman, the more terrible the crime must be. Inside the vicarage, the atmosphere was strained. Mrs. Clement, pale and fluttering, apologized at every turn for the disgrace of it all. The poor vicarage, forever tainted by such a dreadful occurrence. Mr. Clement himself was subdued, his eyes shadowed by worry and guilt. Family misfortune always seemed doubly shameful to a clergyman. Harriet Blunt had been his cousin, and her end, whatever it was, reflected back upon him. Inspector Graves wasted no time in questioning those most closely connected with the house. Lucy Armitage was summoned first, and though her eyes were red from weeping, there was a certain nervous energy in her manner. She repeated her tale of the creak overhead, her curiosity, her dreadful discovery. Graves pressed her on details. Had you ever seen Miss Blunt go up to the attic before? Lucy shook her head vehemently. No, sir, never. That place is dusty and dark, full of old trunks and such. Only the vicar goes up there now and then for boxes of books. Miss Blunt, she kept to her room most times. She wasn't one for climbing ladders, sir. And yet she went there yesterday. Graves's moustache twitched. Was she alone? I think so, sir. I didn't see anyone follow her, but I couldn't say for certain. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to sit quietly in the drawing-room under the guise of offering comfort to Mrs. Clement, listened without appearing to do so. Her knitting needles clicked gently, her gaze fixed on the neat rows of stitches, but her ears missed not a word. It was not Lucy's story that caught her attention, but the faint tremor in her voice when she denied ever seeing Miss Blunt in the attic before. Miss Marple knew too well how people sometimes told the truth, and sometimes told what they wished to be believed, and the difference, subtle though it was, rarely escaped her notice. After Lucy was dismissed, Inspector Graves turned his attention to the vicar and his wife. They of course knew little. Harriet had been reserved, occasionally sharp in her speech, and had not confided in them. She had arrived 2 weeks ago, claiming she needed a change of air after the loneliness of widowhood. Yet Mrs. Clement admitted with some hesitation that Harriet's stay had not been an entirely peaceful one. She asked many questions, the vicar's wife confessed, her hands twisting in her lap, about the parish, about the people, even about poor Lucy. She seemed to find it amusing to ask after everyone's private affairs. I dare say it was harmless curiosity, but, well, people don't always like to be prodded at. The inspector nodded curtly. Curiosity is often a dangerous trait, madam. It makes enemies outside. The hum of gossip continued. Mrs. Banbury declared confidently to anyone who would listen that Harriet had been murdered because she had found out something shocking. Mr. Pritchard, The chemist was overheard muttering about overexcitement of the nerves, though his sudden departure from the fete had already earned him a suspicious reputation. And at the post office, Mrs. Linton spoke with relish of the quarrel she had witnessed between Harriet and a stranger over a letter that had been wrongly delivered. A letter, she hinted darkly, that might contain secrets worth killing for. Miss Marple, moving quietly from shop to shop that morning, was not above pausing to hear these tales. She never encouraged, never asked a direct question, but her gentle, almost vague interest seemed to unlock people's tongues. She had the air of one to whom secrets might be confided with safety. For surely such an elderly lady would never use them for mischief. Yet, all the while, she tucked each detail neatly away, like threads stored in a sewing basket. By midday, Inspector Graves had formed his first theory, and it was one the villagers eagerly seized upon. He believed Harriet had been surprised in the attic by someone she knew. Perhaps she had gone there of her own accord, seeking some old family possession or hiding some private matter. Perhaps she had stumbled upon another in the act of concealment. Either way, the confrontation had ended fatally. Graves would not yet call it murder. He spoke instead of suspicious circumstances, but his eyes told a sterner tale. He set his men to discreetly searching the attic. They found little of immediate significance. Trunks filled with moth-eaten clothes, boxes of sermons long forgotten, stacks of brittle newspapers. Yet tucked beneath one old trunk was a scrap of paper, torn with words barely legible. Inspector Graves held it up with a frown. The ink was smudged, but Miss Marple, peering innocently over her spectacles, thought she caught the phrase inheritance written there. The inspector folded it carefully away, unwilling to share too much before he had the full picture. That evening, the village was alive with more whispers than ever. Talk of inheritances naturally gave rise to talk of money. The Blunt family, it seemed, had once been well-to-do, though in recent years their fortune had dwindled. Harriet herself was believed to live modestly, yet she had once hinted that her late husband had left her comfortably provided for. Comfort, however, is a matter of perspective, and envy is easily provoked. At the Rose and Crown, the theory of money as motive took root. Someone suggested that Harriet had been writing to a solicitor about an old claim. Another insisted she had spoken of changing her will. The truth of these stories mattered little. In the telling and retelling, they became almost facts. By the end of the evening, many in St. Aldhelm's were convinced Harriet had died because of money, though whose money or whose gain remained obscure. Miss Marple, sitting once more with her knitting by the lamplight, reflected on all she had heard. Money was indeed a frequent motive, but so too were love, jealousy, resentment, and fear. She recalled Harriet's sharp little questions, her probing interest in the affairs of others. It was quite possible that she had stumbled upon some truth better left hidden. And if so, someone in the village might have felt cornered enough to act. The next morning brought further developments. Inspector Graves announced that Harriet's death had not been natural. There were signs, he did not elaborate, which proved she had not simply collapsed. He stopped short of naming it murder, but the implication was clear. Sergeant Weatherby looked grave, and the villagers, hearing of it, were both thrilled and horrified. It was at this point that suspicion began to fix itself upon Lucy Armitage. The maid, after all, had been the one to find the body. She was young, nervous, and poor, a combination that often drew the darker sort of speculation. Mrs. Banbury declared that Lucy had always been sly. Mrs. Linton recalled that Harriet had once scolded Lucy sharply for some small clumsiness. The idea grew that perhaps Harriet had threatened the girl, or caught her at some mischief, and Lucy, in a fit of fear, had lashed out. Inspector Graves, too, seemed inclined to consider the possibility. He questioned Lucy more sternly, asking about her whereabouts during the fete, pressing her on her feelings toward Harriet. The poor girl wept and protested her innocence, but her tears, in the eyes of some, looked like guilt. Miss Marple, however, sat very still as she listened to the chatter. She had observed Lucy carefully, her trembling, her pallor, her frightened glances, and though Lucy had secrets of her own, Miss Marple was quite certain she was no murderess. She saw in her the confusion of youth, the fear of authority, the shame of some small hidden matter, but not the darkness of deliberate crime. She kept her thoughts to herself, of course. It was not her place to argue with the inspector, nor would she have been heeded if she had. Instead, she listened as the villagers condemned or defended the maid, and she watched closely those who spoke too loudly, or not at all, for guilt, Miss Marple knew, often betrayed itself not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. And so, as the sun set once more on St. Aldhelm's, the mystery deepened. The attic remained locked, the inspector continued his inquiries, and the villagers spun their tales. But in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting in her lap, her eyes thoughtful. She had begun to see the faint outline of something not yet clear, but certain to take shape in time. For in every village, behind every smile and every polite word, there lay secrets, and Harriet Blunt, with her prying ways, had come far too close to one of them. Miss Marple knew that soon enough those secrets would betray themselves. All she had to do was wait, watch, and let human nature, foolish, vain, and all too predictable, play its part. Inspector Graves had not been long in the village before he made clear his intention to pursue the matter with all diligence. The body of Harriet Blunt had been taken to the county infirmary for examination, though even before the official word returned, the inspector was privately convinced it was murder. The faint bruising on the neck, the disarray of her clothing, and the unnatural stillness of her face told their own tale. Yet without the post-mortem report, he would not declare it openly, preferring to keep the villagers simmering rather than inflamed. The gossip, however, needed no such restraint. By the following morning, it was not merely accepted as fact that Harriet had been murdered, but that the manner of her death was a violent one. Some said she had been strangled with a cord. Others whispered of a blow struck with some heavy object. A few, inspired by the lurid novels they had read in youth, spoke of poison and hidden vials. None of them were entirely correct, but all were convinced. Lucy Armitage remained the focus of much suspicion. It was whispered that she had been seen, in tears the evening before, standing near the churchyard with Arthur Price, the greengrocer's son. What business had she with him, unless there was something shameful to confess? Mrs. Banbury, ever eager to fan the flames, declared she had never trusted that girl. The postmistress, who prided herself on her fairness, admitted gravely that Lucy was not steady. Inspector Graves, aware of these murmurings, summoned Arthur Price for questioning. Arthur, a tall, earnest young man of 20, came with an anxious expression, and mud still clinging to his boots. He denied everything hotly. Yes, he had spoken. With Lucy, what of it? She was a friend, a girl in distress. There was nothing improper in that. No, he had not been in the vicarage attic. Why would he? His hands were calloused with honest work, not the deeds of a murderer. Graves eyed him shrewdly. "You're engaged, are you not? To Mary Hill?" Arthur flushed. "Yes, Mary and I are to be married in the autumn. But that doesn't mean I cannot speak to Lucy. She's been frightened out of her wits, poor thing. And well, I've known her since we were children." The inspector let him go, but not without a note of caution. "See that your loyalty does not land you in difficulty, young man. It is a serious business, this, and those who entangle themselves in it will be called to account." Arthur left, his jaw tight with indignation. Miss Marple, who had happened to be nearby under the pretext of delivering a jar of plum jam to the vicarage kitchen, observed his departure with quiet interest. She had seen the way Arthur's eyes darted when Lucy's name was mentioned, the tension in his hands as he clenched them at his sides. The boy was honest, she felt certain, but honesty often went hand in hand with foolishness, and foolishness, in matters of love and loyalty, could be very dangerous indeed. That afternoon, the village settled into a restless quiet. Children were kept indoors, doors were bolted earlier than usual, and the once cheerful air of the fete was replaced with suspicion. Neighbours regarded each other with narrowed eyes. The milkman was late with his deliveries, and someone muttered that he had been seen near the vicarage gate at the hour of the fete. The dressmaker, Mrs. Hargreaves, declared that Harriet had owed her money for alterations, and suggested with a sniff that such debts were not easily forgiven. The simplest actions, once overlooked, now seemed sinister. Miss Marple, for her part, did not allow herself to be swept away by speculation. She went about her usual errands, pausing in shops and parlours, listening more than speaking. She had observed often enough that when something dreadful occurred, people revealed their true selves more plainly than at any other time. The braggarts boasted more loudly, the timid shrank further, and the guilty betrayed themselves by overcompensation or silence. It was in the draper's that she overheard something of great interest. Mrs. Linton, the postmistress, was speaking in a low but eager voice to Mrs. Banbury. "I tell you, I delivered a letter to her only last week. Came from London, it did, with a solicitor's seal. She seemed very agitated when she opened it, pressed me with questions, too, about whether anyone else had had such post. Quite out of the ordinary." Mrs. Banbury clucked her tongue. "Solicitors' letters always mean money, or trouble, and often both." Miss Marple bent her head over a display of cotton thread, her expression vague, but her ears pricked. A solicitor's letter, agitation, and then the woman's sudden death. These were not coincidences. Harriet Blunt, she thought, had been on the verge of something important enough to unsettle her, perhaps important enough to endanger her. Later that evening, Inspector Graves himself called at Miss Marple's cottage. He was courteous but reserved, the kind of man who did not easily admit an outsider's help. Yet he had already heard of her reputation, her curious knack for seeing through muddles where others did not. He asked in his brisk way whether she had noticed anything unusual at the fete. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded him mildly. "Oh, Nothing much, Inspector. Only the ordinary things one sees in a village. People showing rather more of themselves than they know. It is a pity about poor Harriet, of course. She was not perhaps very popular. Very popular. Graves's eyes narrowed slightly. Unpopular enough to be killed, Miss Marple? She gave a soft, almost apologetic smile. Well, human nature being what it is, Inspector, I have always found that people can endure many things. Poverty, disappointment, even illness. But what they cannot abide is interference. Poor Harriet was rather inclined to pry. That is not always wise. The inspector regarded her for a long moment. He was not a man to dismiss the words of anyone who spoke with such quiet conviction, however elderly and unassuming she might be. Interference, you say? Then perhaps she pried into the wrong matter. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed gently. The following day brought fresh excitement. Word spread that the post-mortem had confirmed what many suspected. Harriet had been strangled. There was no mistaking the marks, no chance of natural causes. Murder was no longer whispered. It was spoken aloud. The village reeled with the knowledge, horrified yet secretly thrilled at the drama that had fallen into their midst. Inspector Graves acted swiftly. He ordered a search of Harriet's room at the vicarage. Among her belongings they discovered letters tied with ribbon, notebooks filled with observations in Harriet's sharp hand, and most curious of all, a small locked box. The inspector pocketed the box, promising to have it forced open at the station. But Miss Marple, who had seen it in his hand, noted the faint smell of lavender about it, and the tiny fleck of sealing wax clinging to its edge. By now, suspicion had begun to drift from Lucy to others. Mr. Pritchard, the chemist, had grown increasingly nervous, his hands shaking as he measured out powders. Some said Harriet had threatened to expose something about him. Others muttered that she had visited his shop to inquire about sleeping draughts. His sudden disappearance from the fete, too, did him no favours. Miss Marple sat in her garden, trimming her roses, when Mrs. Price passed by with her basket. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, and then, almost without prompting, Mrs. Price leaned closer. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, I shouldn't be surprised if it were the chemist. He's always been a queer one, and Harriet, she was not above asking questions that might touch a nerve. Mark my words, she found out something she wasn't meant to." Miss Marple nodded kindly, though she gave no opinion. But in her own mind she reflected that suspicion, which shifted too easily from one person to another, was rarely well-founded. People liked to fix blame on those who seemed different, those who could be safely condemned without fear of reprisal. The truth, however, was seldom so simple. That night, as she sat in her parlour, the old clock ticking steadily beside her, Miss Marple gathered the threads of all she had heard. Harriet Blunt had been strangled in the attic, a place she had no reason to go. She had received a solicitor's letter that agitated her. She had been prying into people's affairs, asking questions that made others uncomfortable. Lucy Armitage had discovered the body, but Lucy's fear was of another kind, not the fear of guilt, but of some private shame. Arthur Price, loyal and hot-headed, had entangled himself by defending her, and the chemist, nervous and evasive, seemed burdened by some secret of his own. The picture was not yet clear, but the outlines were forming. Harriet had stumbled upon something. Of that Miss Marple was sure. The attic was not random, it was chosen. Either she had gone there to hide something or to find it, and in doing so, she had met her death. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles poised in mid-air, her face thoughtful. The solution was not yet in sight, but she knew it would come, for human nature, with all its vanities and follies, could not help but betray itself. And in the quiet little village of St. Aldhelms, where everyone knew everyone else's business, no secret could be hidden forever. The locked box, carried away by Inspector Graves, became the subject of even more speculation than the attic itself. It was not long before half the village had decided what it must contain. Some were certain it held money. Others swore it must be letters, scandalous ones perhaps, the kind that revealed affairs or illegitimate children. A few of the more imaginative souls whispered of jewels or documents that proved an ancient family feud. By nightfall, the locked box was discussed in nearly every household, as if its unseen contents might change the lives of every villager at once. Inspector Graves, however, gave nothing away. He was a man who valued secrecy in the early stages of inquiry, and though he had indeed opened the box the following morning, he shared his findings with no one save Sergeant Weatherby. Yet the inspector's sharp eyes and brisk manner betrayed that what he had discovered was both significant and troubling. He began to move with greater urgency, questioning people more directly, following up leads with a precision that made the villagers tremble. He was a man closing in, and those who felt themselves in danger of exposure knew it. Miss Marple observed all this with her usual air of quiet detachment. She had, after all, been present when the inspector first handled the box, and her sharp, old eyes had not missed the faint smudge of sealing wax and the lavender scent. These details, trivial to others, told her something of the sort of person Harriet had been. Careful, secretive, and not averse to using little contrivances to hide things away. Harriet Blunt had not been the sort to leave her treasures, or her secrets lying in the open. Whatever was in that box had mattered a great deal to her, and therefore, by extension, it would matter to the one who had killed her. It was not long before suspicion turned to Mr. Pritchard, the chemist. His nervousness increased daily, and his behaviour grew more erratic. Where once he had been precise and steady, measuring powders with a surgeon's care, he now spilt his wares and snapped at customers. Villagers noted the change with relish, for nothing made gossip more delicious than a man already behaving like the villain in a melodrama. Inspector Graves, too, had observed this shift, and he called upon Mr. Pritchard at his shop. The interview was overheard, inevitably, by Mrs. Banbury, who happened to be in for cough lozenges. Though the inspector's tone was stern and low, and the chemist's answers hurried, Mrs. Banbury managed to gather that Harriet had indeed been asking him questions about draughts, sleeping powders, and their effects. Pritchard had protested that it was idle curiosity, but his agitation suggested otherwise. By the time Mrs. Banbury left the shop, she had half the tale ready for circulation, and before sunset it was known in every corner of St. Aldhelms that Harriet had sought drugs from the chemist. Whether she intended them for herself or for another was left to the imagination. Miss Marple did not allow herself to be drawn into the gossip. She walked the lanes with her usual serenity, noting instead the subtler shifts, the strained politeness between Arthur Price and his betrothed Mary Hill, the way Lucy Armitage flinched whenever Mrs. Banbury passed, the nervous haste with which Mr. Clement avoided mention of his late cousin. All were ripples upon the surface, each betraying some undercurrent below. It was, however, Mrs. Linton at the post office who provided the next piece of the puzzle. She confided in her precise way that Harriet had received more than one solicitor's letter in recent weeks. They came from London, sealed with the same insignia, and Harriet had been most eager to collect them the moment they arrived. She had even asked whether any letters addressed to another name. She had mentioned the name Arkwright, Mrs. Linton thought, had ever come through the office. Mrs. Linton, of course, had said no, but she found it peculiar. This was information Miss Marple received with a polite nod and a thoughtful glance downward. Harriet Blunt searching after letters, not her own, asking about a name that no one in the village recognized. Such behaviour had the ring of something more than idle curiosity. Letters, solicitors, inheritances, and now perhaps another name altogether. It began to form a shape in Miss Marple's mind, though not yet a clear one. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves pressed harder. He visited the Rose and Crown and spoke with the landlord, who recalled that Harriet had once sat in the parlour with a stranger from out of town, a man who had arrived by motor car, stayed for only an hour, and left without giving his name. Harriet had seemed unsettled after that meeting, pale and tense. This, too, found its way into the inspector's notes and into the eager ears of the villagers. The idea of a mysterious outsider now entered the story, and by the evening's end, half of St. Aldhelm's believed the murderer to be some man from London who had slipped in and out, unseen but deadly. Miss Marple, though, thought differently. She had seen enough of life to know that most crimes did not come from strangers, but from those closest to home. It was the quarrels between neighbours, the jealousies between friends, the envies within families that bred the darkest deeds. Strangers might indeed appear, but their significance was often less direct than people imagined. The man at the inn was a thread, yes, but not the whole pattern. The whole pattern. The whole. It was on the third day after Harriet's death that a curious incident occurred. Lucy Armitage, pale and distracted, was seen entering the church at an unusual hour. She remained inside for some time, and when she emerged, her eyes were red as though she had been weeping. Mrs. Price, who happened to be arranging flowers in the porch, spoke to her kindly, but Lucy only shook her head and hurried away. Later, when Miss Marple passed by, Mrs. Price mentioned the matter, adding in a low voice that the poor girl seemed at the edge of breaking. That evening, Miss Marple decided to call upon Lucy at the vicarage. She found the girl folding linens in the small scullery, her movements clumsy, her hands trembling. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner, did not ask abrupt questions. Instead, she spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the roses, the vexations of moths in the wardrobe. Gradually, Lucy began to relax, and at last, in a burst of nervous candour, she admitted what troubled her. "I didn't hurt her, ma'am. I swear it before God. But I did see her go up those stairs that afternoon, and I thought it odd, but I didn't stop her. And now everyone thinks it's me because I found her. But I only went up because I heard the noise. I never touched her." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Yes, my dear, I believe you. People are very quick to blame the one who stumbles upon the trouble. It is easier sometimes than looking too closely at others." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "But I did hear voices earlier, ma'am, before she went up. She was in the garden, speaking with someone near the yew hedge. I couldn't see who, but she sounded sharp, angry-like. I've been so afraid to tell anyone, in case they think I'm making it up." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind sharpened. An argument before Harriet went up to the attic, a voice unseen, a quarrel unheard by others. This was no small detail. She comforted the girl, left her with soothing words, but carried away with her a new certainty. Harriet had not gone to the attic alone by accident. She had gone there after a confrontation, and perhaps not of her own will. That night the village was restless. The chemist was seen pacing outside his shop long after dark, muttering to himself. Arthur Price quarrelled openly with Mary Hill, their raised voices carrying down the lane, and the vicar sat long in his study, his lamp burning into the small hours. Each household, in its way, seemed burdened by a shadow. Miss Marple, at her window, watched the village settle under the stars. The mystery, she thought, was tightening. Harriet Blunt's prying had touched something dangerous, and now the ripples spread outward. Soon enough, the truth would break through the surface. People always thought they could conceal their secrets, but in the end they betrayed themselves, by word, by glance, by the smallest slip of behaviour, and Miss Marple, who knew human nature better than any inspector, was patient enough to wait for just such a moment. For the attic had whispered its secret in part, and soon, very soon, it would whisper the rest. The following day dawned grey and damp, as though the weather itself had taken on the sombre mood of St. Aldhelm's. A fine mist hung over the village lanes, softening the edges of hedgerows and church spires, and muffling the sound of footsteps. The villagers went about their business reluctantly, as if each one carried some unspoken burden. Even the usual morning chatter at the bakery was subdued, though inevitably conversation always turned back to Harriet Blunt. Inspector Graves had begun to grow impatient. He had pressed Mr. Pritchard harder, hinting openly that the chemist's evasions did him no favours. He had questioned the vicar and his wife again, probing for contradictions, but found little to seize upon. Lucy Armitage remained under a cloud, though her protestations of innocence had not wavered. The inspector was a man accustomed to facts. Fingerprints, evidence, confessions, and St. Aldhelm's, with its shifting half-truths and evasions, was proving more frustrating than most. Miss Marple, however, saw the inspector's frustration as natural. He was trying to build his case upon the wrong foundations. It was not in the dust of attics or in the sealed letters alone that the truth lay, but in the hearts and habits of people, their jealousies, their resentments, their fears. It was here, in this tangle of human nature, that the answer would be found. It was mid-morning when Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Mrs. Hill, Mary's mother. She had a way of slipping into homes under the pretext of visiting, bringing with her some small gift or inquiry. This time it was a jar of quince jelly, which Mrs. Hill received with gratitude. The two women sat in the small parlour, where the ticking of the mantel clock filled the silences between their words. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner, steered the conversation toward Mary and her engagement to Arthur Price. Mrs. Hill, proud but worried, admitted that things had been a trifle unsettled since Harriet's death. Mary was not the sort of girl to raise her voice, yet she had grown sharp with Arthur of late. There were whispers, Mrs. Hill confessed reluctantly, that Arthur had been seen with Lucy more often than propriety allowed. Mary won't speak of it plain, she sighed, but I can see it weighs on her, and Harriet, she was one for poking her nose where it wasn't wanted. She made some remark to Mary only last week that left the poor girl in tears. I don't know what was said, but it wasn't kind. Miss Marple listened carefully, her fingers resting lightly on the handle of her teacup. Harriet, she thought, had not confined her curiosity to letters and wills. She had interfered in matters of the heart as well, stirring jealousies that already lay close to the surface. Such jealousies were not to be dismissed lightly. They could fester and turn bitter, especially in a small village where every glance and word was noted. Later that same day, Inspector Graves received the results of his inquiry into Harriet's finances. Contrary to what many had believed, she was not comfortably wealthy. Indeed, her resources were modest, and she had been corresponding with a solicitor about a possible inheritance tied to a distant branch of her late husband's family. The name Arkwright appeared in those letters. If the claim succeeded, Harriet might have received a considerable sum, though nothing had yet been settled. The inspector made this known only to a few, but in a village, secrets have a way of leaking. By evening, the talk of money was louder than ever. Miss Marple reflected on this news with interest. It explained Harriet's agitation, her eagerness to press the postmistress about letters, her sharp inquiries into matters that seemed unrelated. Money, or the prospect of it, had a way of stirring up old resentments. If Harriet had spoken too freely about her hopes, or if someone else feared they might be excluded from such fortune, it could well have given rise to murder. Yet Miss Marple sensed the truth lay deeper still. It was not merely money, but something entangled with it, something personal. That evening, as she sat in her parlour with her knitting, she considered Lucy's confession of overhearing voices near the yew hedge. Harriet had argued with someone who had managed to remain unseen. That quarrel, Miss Marple was convinced, was the key, for Harriet had gone to the attic shortly afterward, and there she had met her death. If only Lucy had been able to identify the voice. But then, Miss Marple thought, voices often betray themselves in other ways, through tone, manner, and the small echoes of words repeated in different contexts. She resolved to listen even more closely in the coming days. The inspector, meanwhile, pursued his investigation with renewed vigour. He summoned Arthur Price again, this time in the presence of Mary. Arthur, flushed and defensive, insisted that his friendship with Lucy was innocent. Mary, pale and tight-lipped, said little, but her eyes betrayed hurt and suspicion. Graves pressed them both, asking whether Harriet had ever spoken to them about their relationship. Arthur admitted reluctantly that she had. She said things to upset Mary. Said I wasn't steady, that Lucy was prettier, that Mary ought to think twice before marrying me. I told her to keep out of it, but she only laughed. His voice hardened. She liked making mischief. Mary looked away, her hands clenched in her lap. The inspector noted her silence with interest. A proud girl, wounded in her pride, might be capable of rash actions. Yet Miss Marple, who happened to be present under the pretext of offering comfort to Mrs. Clement in the adjoining room, thought otherwise. Mary was hurt, yes, but hers was the pain of a heart wounded by love, not the cold calculation of murder. No, the guilty hand lay elsewhere. It was 2 days later when a new revelation came. One of the inspector's men, searching again through Harriet's room, discovered a folded paper tucked into the lining of a dress pocket. It was a letter, unsigned, written in hurried, uneven script. The words were blunt. You had best keep your mouth shut. If you tell what you know, you'll regret it. The inspector showed it only to the vicar and his wife, but word of it soon spread. The villagers now spoke openly of blackmail. Blackmail, Miss Marple reflected, was indeed a powerful motive. Harriet's prying had perhaps unearthed something dark enough that someone would pay or kill to keep it hidden. The question was, what secret had she stumbled upon? And who among them would be desperate enough to silence her? The days passed, and the tension in St. Aldhelm's grew unbearable. People avoided one another in the lanes, or else watched with narrowed eyes. Conversations that once turned to gardens and recipes now circled endlessly around Harriet's death. The chemist, increasingly pale, locked his shop early and was seen pacing at night. Arthur and Mary quarrelled more openly, their voices raised. Lucy went about her duties with red eyes, shrinking under the weight of suspicion. Even the vicar grew short-tempered, snapping at his parishioners during a sermon about the sin of gossip. And all the while, Miss Marple watched. She moved quietly, speaking kindly, knitting steadily, and listening with an attentiveness that seemed merely grandmotherly. Yet every remark, every slip of the tongue was filed away in her mind. She had begun to suspect where the truth lay, though it was not yet time to speak it. Human nature, she knew, must be allowed to run its course. The guilty would stumble sooner or later, tripped by their own fear. That stumble came sooner than she expected. One evening, passing by the churchyard, Miss Marple overheard a voice speaking in a harsh whisper. It was Mr. Pritchard, the chemist. He was alone, yet he muttered as if in argument with himself. Foolish woman, always asking, wouldn't leave it alone, had to pry, had to poke. Now look, what's come of it? He broke off suddenly, as though aware of his own recklessness, and hurried away. Miss Marple stood in the shadows, her face calm, her eyes bright with certainty. She knew now that Harriet had indeed stumbled upon something dangerous. The chemist had not confessed, but his words, unguarded and bitter, betrayed him. Yet whether he had killed her himself, or whether he feared exposure for another secret, was not yet clear. She would have to draw him out, gently and carefully, until the final truth was revealed. The village, meanwhile, teetered on the edge of hysteria. The locked box, the letters, the whispered threats, all had spun a web of intrigue so dense that no one could see through it. But Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and her knowledge of human weakness, was quietly unravelling it, thread by thread. She did not hurry. She never hurried, for she knew that the guilty hand, once it had acted, would always reveal itself again. It was only a matter of waiting and watching and striking at the right moment. And so the shadows deepened over St. Aldhelms, and the village waited, some in fear, some in suspicion, and some in guilty silence. Harriet Blunt's voice was silenced, but her death still spoke, and it was only Miss Marple who truly listened. The morning after Miss Marple had overheard the chemist muttering in the churchyard dawned bright and clear, a striking contrast to the heaviness that hung over the village. Sunshine streamed over tiled roofs and glistened on the hedgerows, but no one in St. Aldhelms seemed inclined to enjoy the fine weather. Windows opened only briefly, doors were kept shut, and the sound of gossip was sharper than birdsong. By now, the story of Harriet Blunt's murder had gathered so many layers of speculation that one might think she had been killed 10 times over in as many ways. And yet, for all the talk, the truth remained hidden. Inspector Graves, brisk and determined, had announced that he would hold a formal questioning at the vicarage that afternoon. He intended to gather those most closely connected with the affair and press them until the inconsistencies began to show. This declaration only fueled the villagers' excitement, and by midday, half the village was lingering near the green, hoping for a glimpse of the proceedings. The other half, equally curious, stayed indoors, but with ears pricked for news. Miss Marple, though moved about her garden with her usual serenity, trimming deadheads from her roses and shaking out crumbs for the birds. To anyone who stopped to speak to her, she seemed the very picture of gentle unconcern. Yet her mind was quietly active. She thought of Mr. Pritchard's whispered self-recriminations, of Lucy's frightened confession about the quarrel near the yew hedge, and of Harriet's letter hinting at threats. All these threads tangled together, and she knew that only by allowing people to speak in their own way, under pressure, would the knots begin to loosen. When the appointed hour came, the gathering at the vicarage was subdued. Mrs. Clement fluttered about, pale and apologetic, while her husband stood grim and weary, trying to maintain the dignity of his house. Inspector Graves sat in the drawing-room, his notebook open, Sergeant Weatherby at his side. One by one, the villagers most closely connected with Harriet were brought in. Arthur Price was first. He stood tall, though his shoulders were stiff, his hands clenched behind his back. Graves pressed him about his relationship with Lucy, about his quarrels with Mary, about Harriet's interference. Arthur admitted that Harriet had spoken slightingly of him, and had taunted Mary, but he denied ever raising a hand against her. His indignation was genuine, but there was also a certain youthful hot-headedness that did him no favours. When dismissed, he left the room with his jaw set, muttering under his breath. Mary Hill followed, her cheeks pale but her eyes steady. She spoke quietly, answering the inspector's questions with composure. Yes, Harriet had upset her, had tried to plant doubts in her mind about Arthur. Yes, she had been hurt and angry, but she would never harm anyone, least of all in such a dreadful way. There was dignity in her manner, and even Inspector Graves seemed unwilling to press her too far. Yet as she withdrew, the inspector noted that the engagement between her and Arthur was no longer as unshakable as once it had been. Lucy Armitage was next, wringing her hands as she entered. She repeated her tale yet again. How she had heard the creak above, how she had gone to investigate, how she had found Harriet's body. Her voice trembled, and she grew more distressed as Graves pressed her about the quarrel she had overheard in the garden. She insisted she had not seen the other person, only heard Harriet's sharp tones. Graves leaned forward, asking if she could swear it was not Arthur, or Mr. Pritchard, or even the vicar himself. Lucy shook her head desperately, saying she could not swear to anything, only that it was a man's voice, low and angry. When at last she was released, she stumbled from the room in tears. Mrs. Clement followed her with fluttering apologies, while Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the window under the pretence of offering moral support, watched closely the expressions of those who remained. The vicar, she noticed, looked more strained than ever, his eyes avoiding those of his parishioners. Mr. Pritchard, who had been called to wait in the hall, fidgeted nervously, his hands twitching as though they longed for something to measure or grind. At last the chemist was summoned. His appearance bore all the signs of a man under heavy strain. His once neat hair was dishevelled, his clothes ill-kept, his face pale. Graves questioned him sharply about Harriet's visit to his shop, about her inquiries into sleeping draughts. Pritchard admitted she had asked, and that he had answered cautiously, but he insisted he had supplied her with nothing. Harriet, he claimed, had been curious, always pressing with questions. He grew agitated under the inspector's steady gaze, stammering over his words, perspiration beading on his brow. "Mr. Pritchard," Graves said at last, his voice hard, "you were heard last night in the churchyard, speaking aloud, words to the effect that Harriet should have left well alone. How do you explain that?" The chemist froze, his eyes darting. I was speaking only to myself. I meant nothing by it. She had been meddlesome, yes, but that does not mean—" He broke off, swallowing hard, his hands trembling visibly. "I had no part in her death. None." Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with Sergeant Weatherby. It was plain the chemist was holding something back, though whether it was guilt or fear remained unclear. When at last the questioning ended, the villagers dispersed in uneasy silence. Nothing decisive had been learned, but the air was heavy with suspicion. Each person felt the weight of eyes upon them. Each wondered who might be whispering their name in connection with the crime. Miss Marple, slipping quietly away, reflected that the inspector's methods were sound enough, but he was pressing too hard on the wrong points. People under suspicion either shut up or blurted out lies. What revealed them was not their words under questioning, but the little slips they made when they thought no one was watching. She resolved, therefore, to watch more closely. That evening, while the inspector dined at the inn and the villagers huddled in their homes, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village lanes. She passed the chemist's shop, its shutters closed tight, and saw the light still burning within. Through the crack she glimpsed Pritchard pacing, muttering, wringing his hands. She paused at the greengrocer's, where Arthur Price was stacking crates in angry haste, his mother watching anxiously. She passed the hill cottage, where Mary sat at the window, her face pale and drawn, and she paused longest at the vicarage, where the light from the study window glowed late into the night. It was in that study, she suspected, that the true heart of the matter might lie. The vicar had been strangely silent throughout, his grief tinged with something more complex. Harriet had been his cousin, his responsibility, and perhaps his burden. She had stirred trouble in his household, pried into matters that might reflect upon him, and now, with her dead, he carried the look of a man haunted. Whether by guilt or by fear, Miss Marple could not yet say. The days that followed saw the village grow taut with tension. Every chance meeting in the lane carried an edge. Neighbours avoided one another, or watched each other too closely. At the Rose and Crown, voices were lowered, conversations hushed when strangers entered. Even the church pews, usually filled with murmured prayers and gentle hymns, seemed heavy with unspoken suspicions. And still Miss Marple waited. She knew the guilty party would falter, for no one, however clever, could sustain the strain of guilt indefinitely. It might come in an unguarded glance, in a careless word, in some action so slight that others would miss it. But she would not miss it. She never did. Her chance came one afternoon, when she stopped at the post office to collect a letter from her nephew. Mrs. Linton, eager as ever, spoke at once of Harriet's letters from London. "Strange thing, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice. "I found an old entry in my records. There was indeed a letter addressed to an Arkwright, only it was misdelivered weeks ago. Went to Mr. Pritchard by mistake, though he brought it back later, saying it wasn't his. But I thought no more of it at the time." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet certainty, though she only smiled faintly and murmured something polite. It was enough. A misdelivered letter, a solicitor's name, and Harriet's eager questions. It fitted. Harriet had learned of that letter, had perhaps confronted Pritchard, and in doing so had sealed her fate. For if that letter revealed some connection between him and the inheritance, or some secret he feared exposure of, then Harriet had held a weapon against him, and Harriet, with her sharp tongue, would not have hesitated to use it. Walking home, Miss Marple felt the pieces settling into place. The chemist's muttered words, the threats in Harriet's hidden letter, the solicitor's correspondence, the agitation in Pritchard's every gesture, all pointed in one direction. But it was not yet enough. She would need to be certain, and certainty required one final test. She would have to draw the truth into the open, by coaxing the guilty hand to betray itself. And so she set her mind to devising the quiet little snare that only she could weave, delicate and unobtrusive, like the lace she so often worked upon. She smiled to herself, a gentle grandmotherly smile, as she turned the key in her cottage door. The end was coming, though none in St. Aldhelm's yet guessed it. The shadows whispered still, but soon they would give up their secret entirely. The discovery about the misdelivered letter remained quietly in Miss Marple's thoughts, like a seed taking root. She had learned long ago that the smallest detail, often overlooked by others, could prove the very cornerstone of truth. The fact that the letter intended for Arkwright had passed through Mr. Pritchard's hands, even briefly, was no coincidence in her mind. Harriet's sudden interest in that name, her agitation upon receiving her own solicitor's correspondence, and the subsequent threats she received all aligned too neatly. Yet, as Miss Marple knew better than most, suspicion and proof were very different things. That afternoon she sat in her parlour, her knitting idle in her lap, staring thoughtfully out at the lane. The inspector's formal questioning had left the village more unsettled than ever. The chemist had revealed his fear too plainly. But fear could mean many things. It could be guilt of the gravest kind, or it could be the dread of exposure for something less deadly, but still ruinous. People sometimes confessed to the wrong thing simply to cover the embarrassment of the truth they wished hidden. Harriet Blunt, with her sharp little questions, had been precisely the sort of woman to stumble upon such weaknesses and exploit them. Miss Marple considered what she had seen and heard these past days. Lucy's frightened tears, Arthur's hot temper, Mary's wounded pride, the vicar's uneasy silence, and Pritchard's trembling evasions. Each one of them bore some secret, large or small, and any of those secrets might have been enough to provoke Harriet's death. Yet she was certain the chemist sat nearest the heart of it. The inspector, meanwhile, pursued his case with a heavy hand. He had called again at the chemist's shop, this time with a warrant to search it. The villagers, gathered discreetly along the street, watched with wide eyes as Graves and Weatherby went through drawers and cupboards, opening jars and boxes, making a thorough examination. Nothing of direct consequence was found, no vials of poison, no incriminating documents. But the very act of searching fanned the flames of gossip. By evening, it was widely declared that the chemist was the murderer and would soon be taken away in chains. Miss Marple, walking slowly down the lane, listened with apparent vagueness to these declarations. But she was not convinced. Graves was too eager to settle the matter, too ready to rest his case upon outward nervousness and circumstantial suspicion. And nervousness, Miss Marple knew, was not proof of guilt. The truth came closer that same night. Returning from a brief visit to the vicarage, Miss Marple took the long way home, cutting across the churchyard as she often did. The air was cool, the grass damp with dew, and the village lay quiet under the rising moon. She was nearing the lych gate when she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She paused, leaning lightly on her cane, and listened. The footsteps faltered, then stopped altogether. Whoever it was, they had not meant to be seen. Miss Marple turned, her expression mild, but the shadows revealed nothing. She continued on, unhurried, and reached her gate safely. Yet she knew beyond doubt that someone had followed her, someone anxious enough to keep to the shadows. Such behaviour suggested a conscience not at ease. The next day, Inspector Graves announced his intention to hold a final round of interviews. He believed the time had come to extract a confession, or at the very least to corner the guilty party. The news spread quickly, and the villagers prepared themselves with a mixture of fear and excitement. It was at this point that Miss Marple decided the time had come for her own quiet test. She had no interest in confronting the guilty with loud accusations. Such methods were crude, and more often than not, they only frightened people into silence. No, her way was subtler. She believed that guilt could be coaxed into the open if one knew where to press, and she meant to press in just the right place. That morning, she paid a visit to Mrs. Banbury under the pretext of asking for a recipe. The baker's wife, bursting with fresh gossip, eagerly recounted all she had heard of the inspector's plans. Miss Marple listened with her usual gentle attention, then sighed softly and remarked, "It does make one wonder what poor Harriet might have found in that attic. I suppose if she had stumbled upon evidence about the inheritance, or perhaps even about Mr. Arkwright, it might explain why she was silenced." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Banbury's eyes widened. "Arkwright? Did you say Arkwright?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said vaguely, her eyes on her knitting bag. "I dare say it was written down somewhere. A curious name, isn't it? Strange that Harriet should have been so interested in it. Why, one would almost imagine it connected with someone in the village." She left soon after, but she knew her words would travel faster than any letter. Within hours, the name Arkwright was on every tongue. By mid-afternoon, the chemist was pale as chalk, his lips pressed tight, while the vicar had retreated into his study with a face ashen and drawn. The name had struck a nerve. That evening, as the inspector prepared for his final questioning, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. She entered quietly, slipping into the parlour where Mrs. Clement was wringing her hands. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I think it might be best if you allowed me a word with your husband before the inspector begins. It is often easier to speak to one who understands the little weaknesses of human nature." Mrs. Clement, flustered and overwhelmed, agreed at once. Miss Marple tapped lightly at the study door and entered. The vicar sat at his desk, his head in his hands. He looked up with a start, his face lined with grief and guilt. "Miss Marple," he murmured, "I cannot bear this. Harriet, poor Harriet, she brought nothing but trouble, yet she did not deserve this end. And now the village is tearing itself apart." Miss Marple sat opposite him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Yes, my dear Mr. Clement, it is dreadful, but such things do happen, and always for a reason. The question is, what did Harriet uncover that made her death inevitable? Was it merely the inheritance, or was it something closer to home? Closer to home?" The vicar swallowed hard, his eyes darting. I cannot say. She was prying, yes, but—" He broke off, his lips trembling. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice soft as a whisper. "You see, I have heard of this name, Arkwright. Harriet was asking about it, and then she received threats, and a letter meant for that very name was misdelivered to Mr. Pritchard. Curious, don't you think?" The vicar's face drained of colour. For a moment he seemed on the brink of speech, but then he pressed his lips together and shook his head. Miss Marple did not press further. She only smiled kindly, rose, and left him to his thoughts. But as she walked back to her cottage under the gathering dusk, she knew she had touched upon the very heart of the matter. The vicar's reaction had been too strong, too telling. Harriet had found out something connected with the name Arkwright, and that knowledge had cost her life. That night, the inspector held his final questioning. The villagers gathered once more at the vicarage, their faces pale with anticipation. Graves, stern and deliberate, laid out the evidence, the bruises, the threats, the hidden letter. He declared that Harriet's death was not the act of a mad intruder, but of someone in their midst. "One of you," he said gravely, "fears what Harriet discovered, and it is that fear which betrayed you." There was silence, heavy and suffocating. The chemist shifted nervously. Arthur clenched his fists. Mary's eyes glistened with unshed tears. The vicar stared at the floor. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner, said nothing. She waited, as she always did, for human nature to do the rest, for it was not in the inspector's questions that the truth would emerge, but in the guilty person's inability to bear the pressure of silence. And so she sat, serene and watchful, as the shadows lengthened in the vicarage parlour. The trap was closing. The guilty, whoever they were, would not be able to hold their tongue much longer, and when they slipped as they must, Miss Marple would be ready to fit the last pieces together, as neatly as stitches in her knitting. The silence in the vicarage parlour stretched so taut that it seemed almost to hum. Inspector Graves sat rigid in his chair, his notebook closed now, as though words had ceased to be of use. Sergeant Weatherby shifted uncomfortably, his eyes moving from face to face, waiting for one of them to crack under the strain. Mrs. Clement wrung her hands in her lap, her lips murmuring half-formed prayers. The vicar sat slumped, staring at the floor with a heaviness that gave him the air of an old man. Though he was not yet 60, Arthur Price shifted angrily in his chair, while Mary, pale but steady, kept her gaze fixed on her hands. Lucy Armitage trembled like a leaf, her breath quick and shallow, while Mr. Pritchard twisted a handkerchief in his hands until it was a crumpled knot. It was Miss Marple who broke the silence, her voice gentle, almost apologetic. And I think, Inspector, that sometimes the difficulty in these matters lies in pressing too hard in one direction. People can become so very nervous under scrutiny, even when their consciences are clear. One sees it time and again, you know, even over the smallest things. A missing sixpence, or a broken cup. And then, of course, there are those who look calm, who never flinch, and yet— She let her words trail off, her eyes mild, as if she had forgotten her point entirely. But her observation had its effect. Mr. Pritchard flushed and shifted in his chair, his lips parting as though to speak. But then he pressed them together. Arthur gave a low exclamation of irritation, muttering about going round in circles. Mary raised her head suddenly, her gaze flickering toward Lucy with a look that was not unkind but weary, and the vicar, whose eyes had been fixed on the floor, lifted them just a fraction too soon, betraying a flicker of unease. Inspector Graves leaned forward, seizing upon the moment. "Very well," he said, his voice clipped. "We'll be plain. Miss Blunt received threats. We found one note among her belongings. There may have been others. Someone here feared her tongue, feared what she might reveal. Now, I put it to you. If Harriet Blunt had discovered something of importance about the Arkwright name, and if that something connected to one of you in this very room, would that not be motive enough?" At the sound of the name, there was a visible ripple. Lucy gasped softly, as though startled to hear it spoken aloud. Mary's lips pressed tightly together, her knuckles white against her lap. Arthur looked blank, almost uncomprehending, but his eyes flickered toward the chemist and Mr. Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard gave a violent start, his handkerchief falling to the floor. The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Well, Mr. Pritchard, you seem to know the name." I don't," he stammered, bending quickly to retrieve the handkerchief. "That is to say, I might have seen it. On a letter, perhaps. But it meant nothing to me. On a letter?" Graves pressed. "A letter addressed to you, perhaps?" Pritchard shook his head violently. No, not to me. It was, well, I returned it. To the postmistress. It was not mine." His voice was thin, defensive, and his hands shook. It was Mary who spoke next, her voice low but clear. "But Harriet knew of it. She asked about it. She asked me too once if I had ever heard the name. I told her no, but she looked at me as if she thought I lied. She was always trying to make people uncomfortable." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. "Yes, my dear. She had a way of doing that. But Harriet was not one to invent things entirely. She had heard the name somewhere, perhaps from that misdelivered letter, perhaps from another. The question is, what did it mean? Why should it disturb so many people? The inspector turned his sharp gaze back upon Pritchard. "I think you'd better tell us, sir, for if you do not, we shall discover it another way, and it will go worse for you." The chemist's face was slick with perspiration. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. At last he whispered, "Arkwright was my mother's name." A murmur ran around the room. The vicar made a small sound, half sigh, half groan. Lucy's eyes widened, and Arthur frowned in confusion. "Yes," Pritchard went on, his voice shaking. I was not born Pritchard. My mother was an Arkwright. She married my father after difficulties. There was talk of property once, of inheritance, but it never came to anything. I left it buried. I made my life here as Pritchard, respectable, quiet. Harriet must have learned of it somehow, and she began to pry. She asked me questions that made it clear she knew more than she ought. She hinted. He broke off, pressing his handkerchief to his mouth. Inspector Graves's eyes gleamed. "And so you silenced her?" Pritchard sprang to his feet, his hands shaking. "No, I swear it, I did not kill her. She frightened me, yes. She made me fear she would expose things best forgotten. But I would never, never." Graves rose too, his voice hard. "Your nerves, your evasions, your mutterings, these do not help you, Mr. Pritchard. The evidence points squarely at you." There was a tense pause, broken only by Lucy's soft sobbing. It seemed the chemist would collapse under the inspector's stern gaze. But Miss Marple, still knitting calmly, spoke once more in her mild, almost absent-minded way. "And yet," she said, "Harriet was found in the attic." "Why the attic, Inspector? Not in her room, not in the garden, not even in the chemist's shop. But the attic, a place she had no reason to go. Unless, of course, someone else had reason to draw her there." Her words fell gently into the silence, but their effect was profound. The vicar's head jerked up, his face stricken. Mary looked swiftly toward him, then back down at her lap. Arthur shifted uneasily. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft, almost as though she were thinking aloud. Harriet had argued with someone by the yew hedge. Lucy heard the voices. A quarrel, sharp and angry. And then Harriet went to the attic. Why should she do that unless persuaded or compelled? Perhaps she was told there was something to see, something that would interest her meddlesome mind. Perhaps she believed she would find evidence of her inheritance, or perhaps she was simply lured there. The vicar gave a strangled sound. "No, no!" Inspector Graves turned on him sharply. "What do you mean by that, sir?" The vicar buried his face in his hands. "I did not kill her," he whispered hoarsely. "But she was prying into things I could not bear to have revealed. She spoke of Arkwright, of old family matters, of things best left in the past. She threatened to shame me, to disgrace the name of Clement. I begged her to stop. I did meet her in the garden, I admit it. I tried to reason with her, but I did not lay a hand upon her, There was a stunned silence. Even Inspector Graves, stern as he was, seemed uncertain. Pritchard stood pale and trembling. The vicar slumped with guilt, Lucy weeping softly, Mary and Arthur caught between pity and dread. Miss Marple, calm and steady, laid down her knitting. "You see, Inspector, that is the difficulty. Both these gentlemen had reason to fear Harriet's tongue. She knew things that touched them both. But fear alone is not proof of guilt. We must look closer, not at their words, but at the simple facts of where and how she was found. The attic, Inspector, remains the key, and until we understand why she was there, we shall not know whose hands silenced her." The inspector's frown deepened, but he did not dismiss her words. He knew her reputation well enough to heed them, however grudgingly. The villagers, too, seemed to lean toward her, as if the quiet authority of her tone carried more weight than the inspector's threats. And in that charged silence, Miss Marple saw it, the faintest flicker across Lucy's face, a shadow that crossed her eyes when the attic was mentioned. Not guilt, perhaps, but knowledge. Something she had not told. Something that might, in the end, shift the course of the entire case. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely in her lap, her eyes downcast. She would not speak yet, not until she was sure, but she knew the moment was coming when the whispering shadows in the attic would reveal their secret at last. And when it came, it would not be loud nor dramatic, but as quiet and inexorable as the click of her knitting needles, subtle, unassuming, and utterly final. The silence in the vicarage parlour lingered after the vicar's faltering confession, heavy as the church bell before it tolls. Inspector Graves tapped his pencil against his notebook, his face unreadable, while Sergeant Weatherby shifted uneasily in his chair. The gathered villagers held their breath, sensing that the threads of suspicion had drawn as tight as they could go. It was then that Miss Marple, with her customary air of mild distraction, laid down her knitting once more. "It is curious, is it not," she said softly, "how people rarely ask themselves the simplest of questions. Not who disliked Harriet, for that would give us a dozen suspects, but rather, why the attic?" Her words drew all eyes to her, though she herself gazed at the carpet as though it were of far greater interest. Harriet had no reason to go there. She was not the sort to dust old trunks or sort forgotten sermons. And yet she went. Why? Because she believed she would find something of value, something to her advantage. And who, pray, would have told her so? Lucy's sobs quieted suddenly, replaced by a stillness too sharp for innocence. Miss Marple lifted her gaze, kindly but firm. "My dear, when I mentioned the attic just now, your face betrayed you. Not with guilt of murder, but with the knowledge of something unsaid. You saw more than you told us, did you not?" Lucy's lips trembled. She faltered, glanced helplessly at Mrs. Clement, then bowed her head. "Yes, I saw her go up. She wasn't alone. Mr. Pritchard was with her. He told her there was something hidden, something about the letters. I didn't want to say, because everyone already thinks so ill of me. But it's true." The chemist gave a hoarse cry. "Lies!" She twists it. His words broke off under the inspector's stern glare. Miss Marple continued gently, as though soothing a frightened child. "You see, Inspector, it makes sense. The misdelivered letter bore the Arkwright name, a name Mr. Pritchard wished buried. Harriet guessed at its importance and pressed him with questions. He told her there was proof, something in the attic, and she, eager as ever to meddle, followed him. But instead of answers, she found her death." Pritchard sank back into his chair, his face grey, the handkerchief slipping from his fingers. He whispered hoarsely, "She would have ruined me. She said she'd tell them all, that I had no right to the inheritance, that I was a fraud. She laughed at me, said I was a coward, that she would expose me at the fete. I lost my head. I only meant to silence her for a moment. But then she was dead." The confession came with a dreadful finality, and for a moment the room was utterly still. Mary drew in a sharp breath. Arthur muttered a curse, and Mrs. Clement buried her face in her hands. Inspector Graves stood, his voice hard and official now. "Mr. Pritchard, you are under arrest for the murder of Harriet Blunt." As the chemist was led away, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with a small sigh. Her expression was not triumphant, but rather one of quiet inevitability, as though she had merely watched human nature unfold in its usual, regrettable pattern. In the days that followed, The village slowly settled back into its rhythms. The chemist's shop was shuttered. The talk in the Rose and Crown turned from wild speculation to sober reflection, and the vicar, though still grieved, found relief in the end of uncertainty. Lucy, freed from suspicion, went about her work with renewed vigour, though she remained shy of the villagers' eyes. Arthur and Mary reconciled, their quarrels soothed by the knowledge that Harriet's interference would trouble them no more. And Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage with its fragrant roses and orderly knitting basket, reflected as she always did. People wondered at wickedness, at how such things could happen in a peaceful place. But Miss Marple, with her deep understanding of human weakness, knew better. It was never extraordinary. Pride, greed, jealousy, these were old sins, and they repeated themselves endlessly, whether in great cities or in small villages like St. Aldhelm's. Harriet Blunt had pried too far, and in so doing had stirred a fear that turned to violence. As she set aside her knitting and gazed out into the fading light of evening, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest sigh. "Poor Harriet," she murmured, "and poor Mr. Pritchard too, for human nature, once cornered, so seldom finds the strength to resist its own folly." The church bell tolled the hour, steady and familiar, and life in the village moved forward. But in the quiet of her heart, Miss Marple knew the truth, that behind every lace curtain, in every tidy parlour, shadows always whispered, and it was only a matter of time before one shadow grew too dark to remain hidden. The case of Harriet Blunt was closed, but Miss Marple's watchful eyes never rested, for she understood better than most that human nature never truly changed, and so she waited, serene as ever, for the next whisper of shadows to stir.